One of the things I do like folks to know about me is that I am associated with Wildland Fire, and I just became in January the president of the International Association of Wildland Fire. That is a global association, basically, of folks who are interested in wildland fire. So it's fire managers, it's fire practitioners, it's researchers, it's nonprofit organizations all over the globe in particular. And so I've threaded a few things throughout my presentation today have to do with fire, and I'm happy to talk about that more if that's of interest to you. I also want to acknowledge Barbara Janulis is here. She is also a member of our board, and I'm really pleased. We have some unbelievably, amazingly committed board members and feel very fortunate to have that kind of support as a dean of a school. So thanks to both of you for being here today. I think we also have some graduates from the Nicholas School. Yay, excellent, wonderful. Love to see those hands, yay. That's wonderful. Thank you for coming and for being here today. Hopefully you'll learn a little bit about what we've been doing over the last 18 months since I've been dean. So my topic for the day is climate change. And hopefully what we're witnessing is a changing climate for climate change. And that's part of the story that I want us to tell today. All too often, I think that we find we have a lot of narratives around the environment and especially climate change that are overly apocalyptic. And we know a lot that social media and the media in general emphasize these narratives of what I call despair. And what we really need are some narratives of hope in terms of where we could be going and what we could be doing constructively to deal with some of these formidable challenges that we face. And so that's what I want to tell you today. Why should we have some hope around this issue of climate change that we often feel is so overwhelming? How can I, as one tiny little person, do anything as it relates to it? So I've got, I don't know, about 30 minutes that I would like to share with you. And at the end of that, I'm hoping that we can have a robust conversation about some of the topics that come up or other things that might be on your mind. And so again, thank you for coming out today on this day, this snowy day, it seems like all of a sudden, when climate might not be at the forefront of your mind, because it does seem like a pretty seasonable day here in North Carolina for us at this time of the year. One of the few seasonable days it feels like we have had this winter so far. So I'm actually grateful for the coolness and the fact that we're going to have some freezing temperatures because we haven't had enough of that so far. All right, so let's take a little bit of a tour. So let's talk about what's been going on here recently. So since 1980, the United States has had more than 250 weather or climate-related disasters that have cost the country in total $1.7 trillion, right? So these are billion-dollar disasters, more than 250 of them costing us more than $1.7 trillion. And just in 2018 alone, 3 of these cost over $70 billion total and resulted in 20 deaths. That's the California fires that were really quite pernicious in 2018, Hurricane Michael, and then Hurricane Florence. And of course, 2018 was not alone in terms of the kind of billion-dollar disasters that we have had. In 2019, we had 14 additional separate billion-dollar disasters. And if you just look at this map and see where they're concentrated, they're really in the heartland of the country, right? You see it just right down there. And those were the floods that we had, as well as the crazy weather, the hurricanes and the thunderstorms that we had over 2019. And what I think is interesting about that is what we're starting to see is more incidents of weather, convective incidents, basically, of where we're getting more intense rainfall and more dramatic weather in general. And this is, you can easily see it visually in this map. And of course, at the end of 2019, I think everybody was really aware, and this was something that really, I think, captured the global imagination in a not positive way, has been the Australian wildland fires. They persisted for an extraordinarily long time, and I can tell you that, you know, I'm in touch with a lot of the fire management folks in Australia on a regular basis. And as they were leading into this year's fire season, there was a sense of dread because they had a record drought leading into this fire season. Everything started incredibly early. And, you know, they are just now coming out of it. But the amount of fatigue that has for the firefighters, and they have a predominantly volunteer firefighting community there in Australia, is enormous. Can you imagine doing this as a part-time job, given the length of fire season they had, especially in New South Wales and Victoria? And so, you know, the toll that this fire season has taken in Australia in human and ecological terms is not going to be known for months, if not years. And there's going to be a lot that we learn about it. But it was pretty spectacular in terms of a signal, I think, that we're getting about what's happening with our climate. And of course, Australia was not alone in terms of what happened in 2019. We can look globally at what's been happening in 2019. So Munich Re, where this data are taken from, is a reinsurance agency. So they're interested in sort of like where are they paying out claims and where are the biggest disasters. So if you want to know climate data, go to the insurance companies because it hits their bottom line and they are tracking this like nobody's business. But what's interesting here are the symbols there at the bottom. So the green dots are meteorological events, the blue dots are hydrological events, and the yellow dots are climatological events. So you get a sense of the global environmental consequence, right? Geophysical events are also captured, but most of these are being driven by extreme storms and floods. So just kind of interesting. And if we think about what has been happening over time, this is some trend data. So if you look at this, so that last column is the average of the last 30 years and what's been happening. And the second column, the one with the circles, is the average of the last 10 years in terms of what's been happening. So the way I interpret this is that we've moved from, we have more, so that's 65 billion in insured losses. We have more insured losses, and again, this is not counting uninsured losses, and you can certainly know who's affected by uninsured losses, those who can least afford to lose. And we have fewer fatalities, so more economic loss and fewer fatalities. We're getting smarter in terms of protecting life, but we are not getting smarter when it comes to protecting sort of assets in general. Catherine, this is kind of to your point about where is it hitting the bottom line that we were talking about earlier. And if you look at this, so this is, as everybody hears about the big Davos meeting that happens every year by the global elite. So that's the World Economic Forum, and they do a risk report every year. So this is hot off the presses from the meeting that just happened last month. And they do a survey of industry experts, so folks in the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector, and the research sector globally, to try to understand what do you think are the most likely risks that face the world at this time, and then what are the ones that will have the greatest impact. So that's the likelihood and the impact piece that you see up there. And what's interesting about that is 9 out of the 10 that are identified in those two areas all have to deal with the environment, right? So this is the global community saying this is what's going on. And almost all of them point to the challenge that we have with climate change, if we think about it that way. Climate touches on a lot of that. All right. So, actually, I need to catch up on where I am with my notes. That's what the global elite say, and I think that's interesting, but I think all of us in this room probably have a story of some sort or another about you see changing around you in some way. So, so when I looked at who was coming today, thank you all for coming, I looked at where some of the people were coming from, and I knew some folks were coming from DC, and so I just wanted to emphasize a couple of sort of more localized events. So in 2009, DC experienced its snowpocalypse, and I think this was in, I have to look for sure, December 2009. 20 inches of snow fell in one fell swoop. Basically an entire year's worth of snow fell in one 24-hour period. This gets back to what you were saying back there, which is we have more intense events, but fewer of them, right? So we don't get as much snow all in one fell swoop, but when we get it, it all comes down at once. And not to be outdone, just 3 months later, DC had the second event that was basically 18 to 32 inches of snow, depending on where you were in the city, just 3 months later, right? So these back-to-back huge storms that just cause incredible damage to everything around it when you think about the infrastructure, the trees, and all these other sorts of things. So greater intensity. This next one is from Texas. Hurricane Harvey hit in 2017, the second most costly hurricane in the history of the United States since the 1900s, $125 billion of damage. Does anybody remember what the most costly?
Oh, no. I thought you were going to say, is anyone from Texas? I think that's my neighborhood.
Good. See, I was paying attention to who was coming, so I was trying to include a couple of slides where people were from. But yeah, is anybody else here from Texas? Excellent. Yeah, so what was the number one most costly hurricane in the United States? Katrina, very good. Does anybody know what number 3 was?
Sandy.
No. Maria. Very good, yeah, exactly. Sandy did a lot of damage, but it wasn't a hurricane, so superstorm, right? And so that's a technicality, but it was very expensive all the same. But yeah, enormous damage, and you know, for the damage lasts for a long time. It's not just the event, I think, is the other thing, is that when we have these events, they have a cumulative impact on us. Of course, in 2018, Hurricane Florence came through North Carolina and hit us. We experienced ground zero was the Marine Lab in Beaufort, North Carolina, basically where our Marine Lab is, which is part of the school. Anybody here ever spend any time down at the Marine Lab? Oh, that so warms my heart. That's great. It's still there, stronger than it was before. So we had damage to about 20 of our buildings, 20 of the 21 buildings down there, and we had a chance to go in and do some incredible renovations, and everything stood really well, because we all know that just this year, basically, Dorian came through. And of course, Dorian came through the Bahamas, and you probably saw the news coverage of that time. It looked like an atomic bomb had gone off in that country. I mean, just in terms of the intensity of the damage. And while the slide sort of indicates that they had winds of 160 miles an hour, they had gusts of up to 185 miles an hour, the strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic, right, for those kind of gusts of winds. And so Dorian also came through and affected the Marine Lab. We got hit again, but the renovations that we had done made us more resilient, and we didn't take on nearly the water or anything like that the second time through. So we're learning, and that's what we all have to do, is learn how to build when we are rebuilding, to be stronger and smarter, so it doesn't have the damage the next time around. So I'm going to take a little bit of a time out here and talk a little bit about the science. So we often talk about climate and weather, and we're often reluctant to link any specific event. So can we say that Dorian is caused by climate change? As scientists, we're often reluctant to say there's a one-to-one correlation there, but I think it's important to understand why we think there is a connection. All right? So let's just talk about hurricanes. As the oceans warm, and we know with climate change that's what's happening, there's more, the ocean temperatures are rising. That's what provides the energy that fuels the engine of a hurricane. So that energy starts to rise, it creates a convection, basically, and then you have winds that come in from the side that get the whole thing turning. So as oceans start to warm, we can expect hurricanes to become more intense, and that's basically what fuels them. So interestingly, as what the IPCC says, so that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's all of those scientists globally that sort of make these large pronouncements about what we know about climate science, say that we will most likely have fewer hurricanes, but the ones that we have will be more intense. So that seems fairly consistent in terms of what we're seeing across a couple of different things. But this is why. And then if we think about wildland fires, and this is sort of for the Intermountain West that are driven by snow melt hydrology. So what happens is that as temperatures rise, you have snow that falls on the top of those mountains, and that snow melts sooner, which basically means you have less moisture in the entire system, which means the forests become drier earlier and stay drier longer, which just sets you up for an increase in wildland fire risk. So again, it's not that climate change is directly causally related to a specific event. It's that we understand that the physics behind it are driving some of these larger changes, which leads us to believe that these are just not isolated, but they will continue as the globe continues to warm. That make sense? All right, so that's just a quick sort of science break. So what are the consequences of these sort of changes and experiences that we're having with weather and climate? What are the impacts that they're having? So this is a poll, a recent poll that comes out from Climate Change Communication Center. That's with George Mason University and the Yale program on climate and communication. And this is just November 2019, so just a few months old. And what we're seeing is that instead of just looking at Republicans and Democrats, which has been a traditional way of looking at climate change and to understand the polarization, what they're trying to understand is these, they call it the 6 Americas. Who's alarmed, who's concerned, who's cautious, who's disengaged, who's doubtful, and who's dismissive. And what we're starting to see is a change, and I think that's optimistic. So what we're seeing over time is the amount of people that are concerned and alarmed has been growing. So this is in the last 5 years. And the number who are dismissive and doubtful has been shrinking. So these are some of the biggest changes we've seen in recent time. And I think that gives us a cause for hope, because attitudes, I think, are finally shifting. So that's encouraging in my mind. And this I just heard about this report today when I was driving actually over here this morning. which is, so the Pew Research Center does a survey of this every year, and they've been surveying attitudes on the environment for 20 years. And what we're seeing is some of the, so these are the question is, what percentage who say X, either the environment or climate, for instance, should be a top priority for the president and Congress? Really important for us in an election year, right? And so we see that both climate change and the environment are rising in their numbers in terms of their importance for the first time in a long time. So attitudes are changing. Interesting. And so the question is why? Why is that happening? So 76% of Americans who believe in climate change say basically recent severe weather is part of what's driving that change for them. Like, we are viscerally making connections with what's happening around us and saying, hey, you know, when you wonky wonk scientists talk about climate change, great, but when I feel it and experience it and see it, it starts to mean something to me. And that's a real important lesson. That's a very important lesson for us as communicators and people who care about this issue. So 76% of Americans who believe in climate change say recent severe weather is the major reason why. All right. And so that's good news for us, I think. I think that's good news for us. So 72% of Americans say climate change is real and it's already happening. And 61% of Americans want government to, quote unquote, do something about it. What that do something is very, very murky, though. Do something, right? We've got a charge to do something. And so we have to take that with care. If we treat that with care, we have something of a mandate, perhaps, to do something. So the question is, what do we do? And how do we treat that with care? So I think this creates an opportunity for us for the first time in a long time in terms of taking environmental action that could potentially allow us to cross the divide from between Republicans and Democrats. How could we bring those things together? Because if people are experiencing this at the local level, they're concerned about costs, they're concerned about their grandkids, just like everybody is. How can we build a coalition to actually take action on this issue that one might suggest is an existential threat to us as a human species? How can we do that? All right. So, I'm going to give you a little of a history lesson now. I gave you a science lesson. Now we're going to talk a little bit about history. So one of the things that we fail to appreciate in these days, in these polarizing times, is that the Republicans have historically played an incredibly strong role in environmental and conservation legislation. So we can go all the way back to Richard Nixon. This is a quote from him in the 1970 State of the Union address, 50 years ago, almost exactly to this month, making a statement how the environment is a common cause for the people of this country, right? And President Nixon, not exactly known as a liberal, was behind the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the passage of the Clean Air Act, the passage of the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. All of those foundational pieces of environmental law, policy, and regulation, right? So there is a long storied history there. It goes, you know, if you come forward to George H.W. Bush, that's the first Bush, he was behind the creation of the initial Climate Change Agency. He attended the 1992 Rio Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, 1992, and also was behind the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. So a lot of, you know, again, you know, it's not just Nixon. You've got Bush #1 was behind that. We can go all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt in 1905 and the creation of the Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the protection of untold places across this country in terms of concern about conservation and environmental values. So there is a long storied history here of Republican action as it relates to the environment and climate. And we've actually had a lot of bipartisan successes in this country around the protection of the environment and climate, but we are terrible with a capital T in telling these success stories. In fact, I think that we like telling ourselves these horrible stories to gin up sort of this apocalyptic narrative, and I'm not sure what purpose it serves. We have got to get better at telling stories of where we have success to give us a sense of hope in terms of how this can be done. And I'll point to the Endangered Species Act. 99% of the species that were granted protection under the Endangered Species Act are still around and with us today. So if you think about the gray wolf or the alligator, or if you think about the grizzly bear or the bald eagle or the whooping crane, they are all with us today. Some of those are even delisted species. And when you protect a keystone species like the ones you see in these pictures, you are also protecting the habitat of countless other species around them. And so the success of the Endangered Species Act also means that we're being successful in a whole variety of other ways. But we don't tell that story. In fact, I would guess that if you said, how are we doing on species protection, people will say, oh, it hasn't been going well. And we know we've got a biodiversity crisis, but we also have really great success stories that we can also be telling. Another success story that I like to highlight is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Who here knows what the Land and Water Conservation Fund is? And that's pretty typical. I usually have about a handful of people that know what the Land and Water Conservation Fund is. So in 1965, Congress passed the Land and Water Conservation Act. And what the Land and Water Conservation Act basically does is provides almost $1 billion a year for the protection of federal, state, and local water and land across the entire United States. Every state and the District of Columbia benefits from this. And every year, money is put aside to protect, everything from local ballparks to Yellowstone National Park and other sort of things. And so it's an amazing program, and it benefits every single American. So just last year at this time, the Senate, so on February 13th, almost exactly a year ago, on February 13th, 2019, the Senate voted 92-8 in favor of the permanent reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And then 2 weeks later, the House voted 363-62, also in favor of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And then 2 weeks after that, President Trump signed that into law. Nobody knows this story. Don't you find that appalling? I do. I mean, seriously, this is an amazing accomplishment in terms of how we can build coalitions together across party lines in service to the people of the United States for the good of the land and the water. And we are terrible at telling these stories. Terrible. Your mission is to tell this story. Make sure more people know. Because it's incredibly important. And I think that has a lesson for us as we try to think about how do we create change? How do we change the climate for climate change? All right? So what is a roadmap that could take us to a climate change consensus? And so I'm going to lay that out for you in terms of what I've been thinking. So the first thing is that it needs to be feasible. And in order for it to be feasible, it means we have to intentionally build a coalition of what's going to work for both Republicans and Democrats. We have to build it across the party line. So it needs to be bipartisan by design. What can we agree on by design? And we are getting traction on this in Congress right now. There are a whole variety of bills in front of different committees right now that actually have this kind of support. So I'm really quite optimistic that there's going to be something that can come out if we can get some consensus together around this. And I think we've got the Land and Water Conservation Fund as an example there to show us how that can be done. The second thing is that it needs to address climate extremes, right? So part of the data that I've showed you so far is that people are connecting these climate extremes and what they're experiencing with climate change. And so whatever we talk about has to be framed about how it's going to address these concerns, right? Because that's what seemingly has traction with the American public right now. That's what they're concerned about. So if we want to build a climate consensus, we have to think about the climate extremes and how it connects to that. And I would suggest that it has to do three things then, basically. It has to make us, actually, that's my next slide. It needs to hit the triple bottom line, basically. And what is the triple bottom line? Basically, it needs to make sure that we stay economically competitive. It needs to make sure we are creating greater resilience. So if we are rebuilding, it has to be more resilient and ready to handle the kind of storm sewers that we need today. And it has to protect our security, right? How does it protect our security in terms of what's going to happen? Because climate change is also a big threat to us when we think about our security into the future. So if it can do those three things, I think that all three of those criteria, if you will, have appeal to a broad swath of the American public. And I think it will allow us to build a coalition across party lines. So if those are the three criteria for success, what could we actually do? If something can do those three things, what could we do? The first thing I think we need to do is advocate for a carbon tax. I'm certainly not novel in putting that out there. I fully support this. 44% of Americans, if you look at this, so this is data from the University of Chicago, came out last year, right about this time last year. University of Chicago, not exactly a liberal bastion of higher education. 44% of Americans support a carbon tax. that support begins to grow if you tie the carbon tax to specific actions, right? People want to know where their money will go. It's easier for me to say, yes, I can support that if I know where my money is going to go. So support climbs if you say, okay, what if we put it to public transportation? It goes to 54%. What if we put it to research and development for renewable energy? It climbs to almost 60%. What if we put it towards environmental restoration? And this was a big surprise. Nobody thought environmental restoration would rank as highly as it did. But almost 2/3 of the American public say, yes, I can support a carbon tax if it goes in support of environmental restoration. I find that truly remarkable, isn't it? I mean, I think that's pretty amazing. So again, another reason for optimism. Very counterintuitive finding, I think, in terms of environmental restoration. So what would that look like? If we were going to put some money towards renewable energy, where might we do that? What might we do? So we could look to Texas, which is one of the amazing leaders in the world. Actually, this is when I was doing research for this presentation, I was like, wow, I didn't know that. Texas, if it were a country, and some people think it is, if it were, exactly, if it were its own country, it would be number 5 in the world in terms of wind production. Remarkable, right? So that's kind of cool. So only behind China, India, Germany, and I think the U.S. as a total, I think, is, yeah. So that's pretty amazing in terms of what they do. So if you, Texas, not the most liberal blue state you usually think about, but if you had a carbon tax and could put it more towards that kind of renewable energy development, that's how you start to build a coalition, build on something that they're already interested in, right? How do we take that a little bit farther? Or go to my home state in West Virginia, that again, has recently turned from blue to red because those people there, my dad's a coal miner, was a coal miner, feel completely left out and behind, where the whole digital economy has gone. They have been left behind. So is there a way to put money into a restoration economy there that can reclaim some of these coal mines, restore some of these rivers, restore some of these mountains, reinvest in some of the natural beauty in areas that make that state so incredible to begin with? So there's a way to bring a restoration economy alive and vibrantly home to places like West Virginia, these rural economies that have been suffering so much, who've been left behind in the digital divide. But there are always going to be people who say, oh, I don't want to pay another tax. I don't want to pay a carbon tax. But if you don't think you are already paying in 1,000 little ways the death of 1,000 cuts in terms of climate change, you are sorely mistaken. And the example that I'll give you is the Camp Fire that happened in 2018 out in California. So that was in Paradise, California. And you all may be aware that PG&E, sort of the utility company, went bankrupt. $30 billion in claims were made against it, and it has filed for bankruptcy, and they're still trying to sort their way through that bankruptcy claim. But there are all sorts of cascading social and economic consequences when an entity like PG&E files for bankruptcy. And if you don't think that the California taxpayers are going to be stuck with this bill, you are sorely mistaken, because I can promise you, sure, those little green apples turn red, you will be. So think about the homeowners that are going to have to pay more in a whole variety of ways that either will not get compensated in full for what they lost. Think about the ratepayers who are going to pay more for electricity just because of how, in order to get themselves out of bankruptcy, those rates will go up. Insurance companies, lots of places are having a hard time actually just even insuring their companies now, because of the consequences, because people understand what the consequences can be. Municipalities have gone bankrupt. You think about the number of people that had to move from Paradise to Chico when they were evacuating, and the consequences that has had on the infrastructure in that tiny little town. You've got these little municipalities that are having to shoulder these enormous financial burdens when you've got environmental refugees moving from one place to another. And then finally, counterintuitively, renewable energy companies are going to have a harder time now because they had a lot of deals with PG&E on really favorable rates with which to sell their solar or wind power to PG&E. All of those contracts are null and void under a bankruptcy and will have to go get back and be renegotiated, and all those rates now will be less favorable to those companies. Does that make sense? So just all of these spillover benefits that we don't think about that roll on when we actually start totaling up those costs. So if you don't think you're paying for a carbon tax already, you are. So why not put that money to good work? So again, first thing is a carbon tax. Second thing, what should we do? Invest in infrastructure. My friend back there, wastewater operations in the city of Houston, right? Lots of incredible costs. So in terms of associated with our infrastructure needs in this country right now. So the Very good. The American Society of Civil Engineers basically estimates the United States has a $2 trillion, that's with a T, $2 trillion investment gap right now in terms of what our needs are in this country related to infrastructure. And if we did a better job investing in infrastructure, whether it was in wastewater in Houston or in sewage treatment plants in West Virginia, we would see an increase in resilience, because we need to understand how we can handle the flows that we are seeing now and how to treat this water, and we need resources to do that, basically. And if we were to improve the resilience that we have at the local level and the state level, ultimately that enhances our economic competitiveness, because we're not always going back and rebuilding. We can invest those dollars more cleverly, basically, in other needs that we have at the state and local level. All right, the third thing we can do. So if the first thing is a carbon tax, the second thing is invest in infrastructure. The third thing is let's explicitly invest in rural areas. All right, rural areas have been left behind, and they have been the sore spot in almost any carbon tax that has been passed in this country or elsewhere. So if you think about Washington tried to pass a carbon tax, this was its sort of Achilles heel. You think about the yellow vest movement that currently is taking place in France. This is what it is all about, right? Why are they wearing those yellow vests? It's people in the rural areas who are really unhappy about what a carbon tax means for them. Canada, Australia. We can go around the world and see how basically the failure to bring along rural constituencies has really hampered, because they can't see how they will win with a carbon tax. And it is up to us to try to help them see how they could win if this was something that we were going to do. So what might that mean? Now, we know that if we manage forests for carbon storage, that's a way to pay people to keep trees on their land and to manage and grow forests basically for carbon storage. We also know that wetlands and other places are really great places, and soil are really great for carbon storage. We could be reducing wildland fire risks all over the United States as well. It means creating more resilient landscapes, doing landscape level work. It means creating more resilient communities in terms of doing work to allow communities to coexist with fire, because we know that's the world that we are going to have to live in, given the directions that we're going with fire. We could do much better to reduce catastrophic flooding. That means rechanneling and looking at how rivers are flowing and preparing our infrastructure to handle those increased flows. And finally, we want to keep working farms working. We want to keep farmers and farming families on their land in a way that will basically be more sustainable, not only for the areas where they are, but so socially, economically, and environmentally. So is there a way for us basically to keep working farms working and putting more money in the hands of people who can farm and do it sustainably? So I'm kind of winding down now in terms of where we're going to end up. So how do we shift the climate dialogue? We need to leverage growing concerns about extreme weather events. I've sort of made my argument about why I think that's the right way to go. And we have to do it in plain, simple English, right? I started by asking you, like, where are you seeing change? Like, those are conversations that you could have with anybody around you. Where are you seeing change? What worries you when you hear about this climate change thing? How are you seeing it play out? Well, I see it in hotter, drier, windier weather, right? And I think about how that's going to impact fire. I see it in more intense rainfall and more longer-lasting drought. And that has consequences for me and my family and my kids and my grandkids, and we all can kind of agree on that. But can we keep it concrete and tie it to the experiences that we all seem to be having? And can we get really explicit about what it means and what we need to do about it? And then finally, advocating for this carbon tax that's invested in infrastructure and rural communities, because I think that's how we build a sustainable political solution to this where everybody can ultimately win. So that's my argument for you today about a changing climate for climate change. And I would be a really terrible dean if I didn't do some shameless self-promotion about my school. So you are all in Granger Hall right now. It doesn't quite look like this because it's not bright and shiny outside. But we love this building. It's really fantastic. It's built in 2014. It's LEED Platinum. We love it. We talked a little bit about the Marine Lab, which is also part of the school. And we also we haven't talked about the Duke Forest. Anybody here spend any time out in Duke Forest? Very good, very good. It's 7,000 acres that we have that we love to call our own, and you can appreciate in a rapidly urbanizing and suburbanizing environment to maintain an intact forest of 7,000 acres plus is a real jewel in our crown collectively. So we're really proud. We're one of the only schools in the nation, if not globally, that have a marine lab, a forest, and our home campus here. So we're really, really proud of that. We have over 70 faculty, 120 staff, 630 or more students right now, and we have 7,000 strong global alumni around the world trying to effect change one person at a time, and we are an army to be reckoned with. Where do our students go? These are recent graduation statistics for us. More than 60% of our students go to work for the private sector these days. That would have been a lot different 10 years ago for obvious reasons. About 13% of our students now go work for local, state, federal government. About another 10, 12, or 11 or 12% go to work in the nonprofit and go to work for nonprofit entities, and that's kind of how it breaks it out. So students go to work for the private sector, I think, because they're much more interested in creating change from within companies these days. The model that I grew up in when I was here back in the early 90s was really, how do you make change from without? How do you use policy, law, regulation to effect change? But we've seen a wholesale change in terms of how change can happen. And so we have students who work from the inside in terms of, I want to be part of somebody who works inside a company to change things, as well as from the outside. So that's a real change that we're seeing. Where do some of our students end up going? How are they trying to emphasize this? One of our students, Lucas Joppa, works for Microsoft as the Chief Environmental Officer. How do we harness the power of data and bring it to bear on some of these incredibly big challenges that we have as a globe? How do we create a climate-stable future? Our faculty, Deb Gallagher, is one of our professors of the practice, was up at the UN this last fall, basically working with business entities, trying to figure out how do we put environmental, sustainability, and social goals to work, environmental, social, and governance goals to work at the board level in different companies to do a better job in highlighting how we can have more sustainable business practices. Alexis Fuge was our graduation speaker last year. She works for Amazon Web Services. You know, her whole premise is that if I can change the value chain in Amazon, imagine the footprint I can have, right? I think that's inspiring. Zach Eiler works to create all these different greenhouse gas programs across North America. What are the different trading schemes that we could potentially have in terms of carbon registries, cap and trade programs, and other sorts of things, so that we can actually, if we had a carbon trading program, what would they all look like? And then finally, Drew Shindell is one of our most famous scientists, among many famous scientists that we have in the school. He was one of the lead authors on the International Panel of Climate Change report, the Global Warming report that was released last year that basically said, how can we keep climate change to 1.5 degrees? I want to thank all of you for coming. Thank you so very much.